City's Other News for May 10th, 2002. I'm your host, Greg Thompson. Today we're going to be talking about drugs and alcohol, specifically drugs and alcohol in relation to Iowa City and the University of Iowa. There have been some recent developments on that front. Just recently, the Iowa Supreme Court slapped down an Ames law on the tobacco issue, banning tobacco from restaurants. Tobacco is a drug, let's not forget that. Also, the City Council here in Iowa City has recently passed a 19 and over only law, rejecting the 21 and over law that was proposed. And there's a lot of things going on in the realm of drug policy here. So we have a distinguished panel here, and 5 of us are going to talk about these things today. So let me introduce the panel. I have on my right here Peter Nathan, who is a psychology professor at the University of Iowa. Teresa Seeberger, who is a member of the Iowa City Other News team and has compiled some amazing statistics on alcohol use. Zlatan Krizan, who is a student, University of Iowa psychology student. And Kyle Fitzgerald, who is a university freshman and who is a member of the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. So let's start off with you, Peter. You've done extensive research on binge drinking here at the University of Iowa and how it compares nationally. So maybe you could start by defining binge drinking for us and tell us what you found in your research.
Well, the usual accepted definition of binge drinking is 5 or more drinks on a single occasion for men and 4 or more drinks on a single occasion for women in a 2-week period. And then frequent binge drinking is doing that 3 or more times. That's by Iowa City standards, not very much drinking, but nationally that's pretty much the standard. Students at the University of Iowa do a great deal of binge drinking, and rates of binge drinking and frequent binge drinking here are very much higher than they are nationally. The national average of binge drinking among students in 140 colleges and universities in the nation is 44%. 44% of students binge drink. That's pretty high. That was pretty surprising when it was reported in the early 90s. Here, it's 70%. That's very, very, very high and just about the highest in the country. Frequent binge drinking, the rate is 19% nationally. 1 in 5 undergraduates drinks in this fashion 3 or more times in 2 weeks. At the University of Iowa, it's 46%. Almost half of the University of Iowa students drink in a binge fashion 3 or more times in 2 weeks. That is almost certainly the highest in the nation.
And how were these statistics compiled or arrived at?
The national statistics and the local statistics were both compiled from self-report surveys from students, asking them to report on not only their drinking, but the consequences of their drinking over the last 2 weeks. And these were anonymous surveys.
And talk about those consequences. What are the consequences of binge
Well, the
drinking?
consequences vary from not very serious, like missing a class or forgetting where you were, what you were doing for some short period of time, to more serious consequences like getting in fights when you've been drinking, or having a problem with friends and family when you've been drinking, to very, very serious consequences like unwanted or unsafe sex that's alcohol related, drunken driving and the like. And there are 11 of those consequences that have been studied nationally. And the rates of those consequences here at the University of Iowa are higher than on all 11 than the rates nationally. So my data suggests that the University of Iowa has a terrible problem, a huge problem, both in terms of binge drinking and its consequences.
Now, when we were talking before the show, you indicated that you think that the fact that Iowa City students or university students are allowed in the bars under 21 is a big contributing factor to that excess drinking. Is that correct?
Well, my data suggest, and they're gathered from 1,500 students, so that's a pretty large group. And from talking to students, my data I think are pretty good. They suggest that when students who are under 21 go in the bars, they drink, and in fact, they drink more than students who are 21 and older. So I think that's the major contributing. It's the only community in the state where 18, 19, and 20-year-olds can drink and do drink, and it's one of the very few in the country. And I think it is the single major factor in these rates, which is why I think the City Council's very unfortunate action the other night is in many ways reprehensible, because it sort of condemns these students to a continuation of a situation which puts their life, their present life and their future life at peril.
Kyle Fitzgerald, you're a freshman at the university.
Yeah.
How does the alcohol situation look to you from inside the dorms? I assume you live in the dorm?
I did live in the dorms. I moved out of the dorms halfway through first semester.
Uh-huh.
As far as there's no way to deny that there's an alcohol problem in Iowa City, because you have a large number of students who come to college and they want to drink. And when you have bars where you can get in at 18, it's possible to get alcohol very easily in Iowa City. But I don't think that it's a huge problem. I mean, on any given night in Iowa City, the majority of people don't know what they're going to do with their night, and the bars just offer the opportunity to do something. The majority of students don't want to go out and binge drink, but they jump on the bandwagon when they see other people doing so. I disagree, though, that we should have a 21 ordinance on the bars, because I and many other people enjoy live music. I go to the green room very frequently to enjoy live music, and I won't deny that I've even had a beer. I'd like to have a drink and enjoy live music. When it comes down to binge drinking, there's a whole nother issue. Binge drinking is when kids get together in the back of in a backyard and they slam kegs and they have keg races. There's really severe instances of binge drinking. I've witnessed it, but my argument is that I think that it all relates to our attitude as a whole in America on alcohol. If you go to any other country where it's accepted and people are, it's really not something that's held back from you, until a certain age, and it's kind of rebellious to get a drink at a bar or go out and drink, and if we were just to be more accepting of it and open about it, there wouldn't be such high instances of binge drinking.
That's interesting. Zlatan Krizan, you're from Croatia, and we were talking about that before also. Tell us about your experiences growing up with alcohol.
Well, I think, my experience was fairly unique, and they don't necessarily generalize to entire, I think, Europe, but there is generally a sense. I grew up on Adriatic, which is a part of the Mediterranean Sea, and I grew up eating fish and a Mediterranean diet in general, and wine is a critical part of it. So I drank wine when I was less than 10, not very big amounts or mixed with water, and I was actually encouraged by family. And it was really a compliment to the meal, just like you have to have your salad, then you have to have a glass of wine. And I think so alcohol was largely demystified by the time you really reach your teens and are interested in having fun and fitting with the group. Also, there was not an official drinking age as well. So people would go into bars and clubs, 13, 14, 15, and there was really kind of unwritten rules in terms of who gets served and who doesn't. And, those rules didn't always work very well, that's definitely for sure. But there was an atmosphere, I think, where the alcohol wasn't, and you made that point, seen as such a bad boy thing to do, and that made it less appealing as well. And I also think there was a support system in terms of friends, and if there were occasions where you'd probably binge drink or drink in a row more than you would have to or should. I think people were mindful of negative consequences, and at certain point, if it was clear that somebody's, let's say, sick or they were not good, I think other people would respond immediately to that. And I think that highlights the larger issue, which is, I mean, I think oftentimes to these things the answer is, you know, the culturally things are wrong, and you know, if we would only view it differently. And unfortunately, you know, those are things that are the hardest, if not impossible, to change. You know, and anytime you want to do something, that's really not a thing you can do, and it makes it really complicated.
Speaking of other countries, Teresa Seeberger, you're a former prosecutor from Benton County, and you've looked up some statistics as to what the drunken driving limits are, and recently in Iowa we've gone from 0.1 to 0.08. How does it work in other countries?
Well, in the United States, we have the highest permissible level of any nation in the world. If you look at the other nations throughout the world, mostly in Europe, but also Canada, but the highest you see is 0.08, and literally you go all the way down to zero tolerance in some of the countries. Czechoslovakia, Estonia, it's zero.
Zero tolerance.
Right. If there's any detectable amount of alcohol in your system, that's a violation of their laws. 0.05 seems to be a common one with Germany, Denmark, Belgium. I know Norway, as others have talked about, 0.2 seems to be another common, or 0.3. I think Czechoslovakia was 0.3 for quite a while before they went to zero tolerance. And just I can tell you from personal experience, since I was able to, have access to a preliminary breath test, PBT, when I would go to a bar with officers, etc. I recall one time when I went and shared a couple pictures with a couple people, and I was the driver. I drove back to town in Benton, Iowa, and I felt that some of the curves I knew I was being affected. Went straight back to the sheriff's department, got on the Intoxilizer, 4011A, which is what they used to use. And I blew a 0.38, so less than half the legal limit at that time. And I knew that I was being affected, that my ability to operate a motor vehicle was being affected.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no doubt, in my mind that, and also I've never actually blown over 0.1 in my many times of, going out and drinking with officers and having the PBT and feeling quite under the influence. I've never even been able to get up to 0.1.
Uh-huh.
So it's clearly my feeling that by the time you're up to 0.1, you are very much under the influence.
You're pretty brave to drive and then go blowing this thing in front of police officers. Do you think they would have arrested you if you'd been over?
Technically, they would have had to.
0.1 for you would be what, 4 drinks in an hour or 5 drinks
4 to
in 2?
5.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this involves something else that I think a lot of time people don't talk about, is that, I think it's the issue of relative impairment. And there's probably no doubt that having even a drink or two will, impair your ability to drive to a certain extent. Fiddling with the radio will definitely do that, maybe not as seriously. Talking on a cell phone is my favorite. Especially when it's extensive, and that constantly detracts attention from what you're supposed to do. Sleepiness is another common problem, and people who drive are very tired. Generally your reflexes will be slower, and there's a lot of time where bad things happen because people are not able enough, I think, to give the concentration to driving that it's necessary. Most of the time, it's very difficult to know why. But with drinking, it's not, because you can test somebody, and that's usually definitely a good suspect.
Now, the other thing is that the drinking, the blood alcohol level, makes all those other things worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's an interesting thing about these blood alcohol levels. When the Iowa legislature was debating whether they were going to give in to the federal government and lower the rate to 0.08, the majority leader of the House was saying that he didn't think Iowa should knuckle under to the federal government. And what he didn't know was that for every 0.01 blood alcohol level increased, rates of accidents double. And so for every decrease of 0.01, rates would decline by half. And so when we lowered the rate from 0.10 to 0.08, we really had quite a substantial effect on the risk of alcohol-related accidents. And that's really very, I think, very, very important. .08, I think it's pretty debatable, as you say, whether that's low enough
Right,
to
right.
protect everybody else.
Right, even at, well, .1, the statistics show, which was the old level, .1, you're 7 times more likely to be involved in a fatality, alcohol-related fatality. And at .15, you're 25 times more likely to be involved in an alcohol-related fatality. And this year, or last year, I think the number in the United States, 17,000 people died as a result of an alcohol-related fatality. And it kind of went down for a couple of years. It was in like 14,000, and then it's going back up now. If you look over a 10-year period, we're talking 150,000 people. People are concerned about SARS right now, which I don't think it's killed anyone in the
We
United
killed
States
500
yet.
so far
Okay.
worldwide.
Right, no one in the United States, I don't believe. Smallpox, clearly, no one. But yeah, 150,000 people in 10 years, and it's just, unfortunately, an acceptable part of our
Zlatan,
American culture.
I'm sorry. Zlatan, talk to us about the difference in transportation in the United States as compared to where you're from.
Well, when you were discussing these things, I just thought that, why this reluctance, I think, on the part of general American culture to have alcohol limits too low and to have be such a struggle to lower it from, 1.0 to .08. And, if you think about, excluding drinking in your own home and drinking definitely being a social activity and really people going out with other people and drinking, how do you get there, With the exception of, New York, Chicago, and a few other places, you have to get there by car. And that means you have to leave there by car as well to get home. And of course, you had ideas for a taxi, which is, a fine idea, but, if the, taxi industry would, would boom if, everybody used it, then obviously there are people who just don't have money for that. Designated driver was another attempt, I think, to deal with that, and that's good as well, again, but, from practical experience, try, designate somebody as a driver, and it's not going to work very well. I think in Europe, it's generally less of a problem because of its history. Had a dense population there for a very long time, and I think public transportation has been available for a long time, and it's just, driving is just not necessary if you want to go out and have a drink and you want to come home safely. In the United States, that's much more difficult, and that just compounds the problem.
Kyle, what do you think? Do you think that this increasing the age at which people can go to the bars is going to cause the parties to go out into the neighborhoods? Some people have suggested that.
Yeah, that's been a huge argument, but I think regardless, parties at houses are going to happen, without having this. They said that the argument was that there's going to be a huge boom in people going to house parties and having house parties, but I really think that if it were 21, kids underage would try and find other means of getting alcohol or getting drunk, and it is a lot more dangerous if you go to a house party. The chances of things being regulated and under control are just it's out the window. At a bar, the cops come in, they look around and make sure things are going on. I think, like you were saying, people in Europe, they're looking out for other people to be over the limit or drunk. Here we're like, oh, look at him, he's passed out, ha ha ha. It's just the way that my generation even looks at drinking, and we just it's all about getting so drunk that you don't remember, and it's cool, it's things to do that it's like fun, and oh, he was so drunk, oh, I don't remember that night. That's the attitude that a lot of us, I don't have that attitude, but a lot of kids do, and a lot of kids don't, but I think it's like the pop culture kind of attitude, and you see it, a lot of this relates to the media that we're showing. Like, I was watching one of those shows, The Real World or something like that, on MTV, and I noticed, like, they go out as a group, and they're all drunk. It shows them drinking in bars and stuff, and kids watch that, even my little sister who's she's a freshman in high school, and she watches this stuff, and it's like, this is the problem right here. They're seeing it, and it's like, oh, that's cool, but oh wait, you have to be 21 to drink. And the people on the show were definitely 21. What's that?
Unless you live in Iowa City.
Unless you live in Iowa City. But the thing is, though, they see that, but they're like, you have to be 21 to drink, but I'll still drink, and I'll go and drink. So I want to mention this. I read a really interesting letter to the editor in the paper. I don't know if you guys caught this, but it was by an economics professor, I believe, and he proposed in it. Said, I'm going to think out of the box a little bit here, and he proposed drinking permits as you would get a permit to drive a
I saw
car.
that.
And I thought that was really, interesting because what he's getting at is if you introduce people to drinking, before they get the opportunity to see it from like their friend's point of view, like, come on, let's go out and get a drink. If your parents were to sit down with you at dinner and offer you, all right, you can have a beer with your dinner, with your meal, and it's not looked at as something like, beer, it's a beer, you're used to it. You've, I guess been introduced to alcohol at a younger age. I think we wouldn't see these people going out and not knowing their limits, not knowing how it affects you, going out getting blasted drunk. And I think of these permits that he proposed, like, it's just an interesting idea. You take a class, you're taught about alcohol, the effects of it, and with this permit, you can go out to a bar. You could even buy, a drink at a bar. But if you're caught drunk driving, or if you're giving certain offenses, you'd have to have it laid out. But if you're caught with public urination or something where it shows that you don't have the responsibility, it's taken away from you. And that's just, it's a good idea, I think, just to get the ball rolling in the right direction. I just thought it was really amazing that he thought about that.
It'd be an interesting concept for adults even.
Maybe, yeah.
'Cause not all the people who get in trouble with alcohol are underage.
That's very true.
But,
It buttresses your point that the Comedy Central, the Learning Channel has a show called While You Were Out, where person, I don't know, married couple or something like that. Well, one person is gone, the other person redecorates a room to surprise them. Comedy Central is coming out with a show called While You Were Drunk, which is a blind date type of show where they will make sure that people, the slogan is something, you'll be surprised how quickly 8 to 9 drinks can change your mind when you go on a blind date. And so that's, again, a kind of reality type thing. And it amazes me. And one thing that I couldn't understand, coming from a culture that potentially there's a lot of drinking, albeit in a very different manner, is, I never thought, where's the fun in passing out and blacking out? I mean, if the whole purpose of drinking is to have fun, I mean, once you pass out, you just can't have fun. I don't think it's possible. The other people can maybe have fun on your account, but that's a different story. Yeah, that's a perplexing thing, and it's and why there's such really pressure to push yourself until you're gone and you can't understand anything anymore. Is
That's part of the inherent
Yeah,
problem of alcohol is you lose your inhibitions, so you you don't realize how intoxicated you've become or how affected. So one more. And
But
then,
binge drinking is really romanticized in America. It is, and
Okay.
especially like with Iowa City. I mean, you've got the dorm life, and those sort of groups of people that they go out as a floor, as a group, and say, all right, we're going to go to this bar and drink and stuff like that. But then the things that get me are like these bar crawls. It's like blatantly, you're wearing a T-shirt, you're saying, I'm, bar crawl. The name itself, you got to crawl to a bar because you're so intoxicated. It's binge drinking, and I can't deny that binge drinking goes on. But where's the solution? How do you help fight the problem of binge drinking? Do you make bars 21? Is that going to really, kill the problem? Will people just automatically, bars are 21, well, then I guess we can't drink anymore? People will still find ways to drink. They'll get even more creative in their ways of binge drinking. And I think that we need to be, I'm not saying that you should open the bars up so kids can come in, because there'll be a mad rush to Iowa City. It'd be like, kids, and there'd be higher incidents of alcohol-related things. And what's his name? I just lost it. But one of the council members brought up the point that people drive from miles away around just to come to Iowa City because they know they can get a drink, underage. And that's a good point. It's definitely, true that Iowa City you can get a drink underage. But I think that the problem is people are coming here and they're driving home, and that's like the real problem. They're not having designated drivers. They're coming to Iowa City to get their drink, and how do we combat that,
But Kyle, I mean, you've obviously thought about these issues a long time. If students at the University of Iowa have the highest rates of, just about the highest rates of binge drinking and these adverse consequences, in the whole country. And if Iowa City is one of the handful of places where students who are under 21 can drink easily, I mean, you obviously see the relationship.
Yeah.
People talk about the fact that, well, if we change the ordinance to 21, then students will just drink as much or more in house parties.
I don't believe that. I don't think that's true.
I mean, that's silly. We know there are lots of data that say if you reduce access, you're going to reduce binge drinking. There'll be some more house parties, but overall, rates of binge drinking will be a lot less. Why can't you, as obviously a very knowledgeable person, why doesn't it make sense to you to see the logic of reducing binge drinking and the consequences with a 21 ordinance and finding some other ways, some other things for students to do?
Well, I think that it's definitely important to say that, you know, alcohol is 21 and we should keep it that way. But kids they want to go out. People want to go out to places where they can socialize and even get a drink. I mean, it's something that you can't deny. People want to be able to go out and get a drink. So it's something it's hard. It's very hard to battle. It's a very hard situation.
What if the city council, in its wisdom,
Infinite wisdom.
and the university, in its wisdom,
Right.
actually, working with students, paid some attention to developing some places that don't necessarily involve alcohol, but do involve very good music and the opportunity to socialize? Is that something that?
That would be a step in the right direction. But what about when you want to go to a place like that has a music venue inside of a bar, where you know an older friend maybe wants to go because he can get a drink, but you'd like to see the show as well. How do we combat that? I would really not have a huge problem with this 21 ordinance if it didn't kill live music in one sense and dancing and socializing like that.
Well, I think everybody ought to work together to try to figure out a way. I mean, there's a way. What if there were an area in these bars where the kids who were under 21 sat and listened to the music and enjoyed themselves, danced, whatever, smoked, now they can smoke again, but they didn't drink. And the kids who were 21 or older sat in another place. Now, granted, if you had a friend who was over 21, that's a problem, but it seems like a small problem.
That would, I mean, if you like, you're segregating the two groups here. It just
Yes.
it doesn't make sense.
It might be difficult.
Yeah.
It makes sense to the
It makes
adults
sense to
over
the
40.
adults who, yeah.
It makes sense if you are not one part of the segregated groups, and I really appreciate, I think, the logic behind what you're saying, and I think that is, I think, the biggest, and that's also accounts for the failure of Planet X, because on Friday night I don't want to go play mini golf
Skee-ball, yeah.
with my friends. And definitely, I mean, you want to go out where there's music and where there's other people, and want to go out with your friends. And yeah, I mean, nobody would want to be, sitting in this part looking at everybody else. Here we are. There's the fence. I don't know, can I cross the fence or not? But there probably is a solution. At University of Minnesota, they have bars just have alcohol-free nights. You pay cover. I mean, that's how they make their money. They'll sell other kind of stuff. They maybe even have an espresso bar. Who knows? So at least something is available. And I mean, the things up there has been going on like that for a long time. I mean, and that really provides access to people under 21 to basically the same music scene. Of course, switching to the system is potentially costly for the establishments, and there'll be probably some resistance to
People who come here are really stunned by the fact that the students here say that there's nothing to do but drink, because most other universities and most other places, there are lots of other things to do. And students here, I'm afraid, have pretty much gotten the short end of the stick. I think that we've all fallen down in failing to develop alcohol-free venues. And I think that's certainly part of the problem. The 21 thing is a big part, but there are lots of others.
Let's, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're a little over halfway through the show. Let's switch over and talk about other drugs now, other than alcohol. Kyle, you're a member of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and I understand that group was formed in response to the federal law that disqualifies anyone with a drug conviction from receiving financial aid.
Right.
What other issues are you working on?
Well, that's the number one issue is.
Before you get started, let me remind our viewers that you're watching Iowa City's Other News for May 10th, 2003. We're talking about drugs and alcohol in Iowa City and at the University of Iowa. Go ahead, Kyle, sorry.
All right. First of all, that's our main issue, is to combat this roadblock of financial aid for people who have, been convicted on a drug charge. I could go out and rape someone, murder. I could be an arsonist. I could burn a church, and still get federal aid for college. Yet, if I were to be caught with a bag of marijuana, for instance, I'm this evil person that's not allowed to get federal money to go to college. It makes no sense in my mind, but it does make sense that it's just another escalation of the war on drugs in America. We've seen the war on drugs definitely affect, it has a ton of really horrid effects on us as Americans and other cultures as well. Look what we do in Colombia. There are many examples. I don't want to point them all out, but I think that one of the main issues that we have with drug policy is we need sensible drug policies, things that aren't, making drugs illegal is more or less making it. People are still using drugs. They're not going to stop using drugs. People want to stimulate themselves. I mean, there are drugs out there. As you see with alcohol, people want to go out and have a drink and get a little buzz and go and dance and have a good time. But there comes a point when there's abuse and stuff like that. There are bad drugs out there like methamphetamines and things like that. Marijuana is definitely a very innocuous drug, and there are a lot of studies that you're kind of shaking your head here, but they'll say that it's a gateway drug to a lot of other drug use and things like that. But one thing that aside from the recreational use of drugs, we think that medical marijuana, for instance, now this is a huge issue that the University of Iowa has very much been at the forefront of this issue, because they organized the first thing, I guess it was a conference on marijuana therapeutics, and they taught doctors and physicians about medical marijuana and how it's used and things like that. It was in, I think, 2001 that they had this conference, but I've just become aware of this. But it's very interesting to look at that and say people are recognizing that marijuana is something that it's a drug. It's a natural drug that can be used to cure things, and not so much cure things, but definitely help aid people who have, I guess, AIDS and cancer. It's definitely something that can help relieve things, and it's turned into this horrible, drug. But there's the big question with legalization of medical marijuana is, well, what if it gets into the wrong hands and things like that?
If I could add just a few things on what you said. In 2000, there were 734,500 marijuana arrests. So that's almost 750,000, and 88% of those were for possession. Currently, there's around 60,000 people in jail for marijuana-related offenses, almost half of which are going to be raped or violated at some point during their jail stay. And the federal government spends only on war on marijuana, so that's excluding other drugs. And I think when you get in the other drugs, the issue becomes more thorny than it is with marijuana. About $9 billion a year for, and just to put some perspective on this, when marijuana Tax Act was passed in 1937 in this country, almost nobody knew what marijuana was. It was predominantly used by Mexican immigrants that came here over the border, and that wasn't kosher with the powers that be at the time. And obviously, there was a huge propaganda for the last 80 years. And I think the biggest problem is the sensible part. There is, over the last 80 years, the public perceptions on marijuana were exaggerated in a negative direction, especially comparatively. And as somebody said, is marijuana good? No. But is aspirin good? Not really. I mean, for this thing under these circumstances. And I think the similar things can be said with marijuana. So I mean, it's just the social cost of having marijuana laws that are in effect today is far, far greater than changing the policy so they're simple. Also, if you look at, I think, dependence rates, some numbers, I think, across studies report about, and there's also been debate, is marijuana addictive or not? And I think everybody recognizes that you can develop psychological addiction in terms of habit, as you can with many other things. I think they quote around 9% compared to, let's say, 15% with alcohol. Not to mention that I don't think there's a single documented case of death from marijuana, which there's plenty of those in terms of alcohol. Does that mean that, smoking marijuana never led somebody, to get themselves in a situation where they were killed? I'm sure that probably happened at some point. But you have to look at the relative, at relative cost, relative danger, and develop some kind of a policy really that minimizes the general social cost associated with the substance, rather than, this is bad, and having, public, the DEA has these misleading ads, such as, they give some figure of people who are arrested for drunk driving, and they say that, 1 out of 3 of those people tested positive for marijuana, and 10 out of them breathe oxygen as well. Instead of giving figures out of marijuana users, how many, let's say, hurt somebody with a car, get into trouble. Of course, those figures are harder to come by, and when they're estimated, they're very unimpressive.
Peter, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. You're wanting to jump in, so go ahead.
Well, I want to say I agree with most of what you say, Kyle. I think that decriminalizing marijuana possession under a certain amount makes a lot of sense. I think medical marijuana use makes a lot of sense. I just wanted to take issue with your characterization of marijuana as innocuous. It's not.
Right.
Marijuana is a hallucinogen.
I said relatively innocuous, but
No, I can't say that. It's
Okay.
much less dangerous than methamphetamine, than
Alcohol.
cocaine, than crack. It's not innocuous. It's a hallucinogen. People who smoke strong marijuana develop hallucinations and delusions for some period of time, and during that time they can get into a lot of trouble. So I don't think we can
Do
or
you speak from any
should.
experience?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, well, I was wondering, because I have no qualms about admitting that when I was at Grinnell College, I smoked quite a bit of marijuana. And
Well,
I never
I'm-
had any
Yeah.
hallucinations.
yeah.
But data
Well, you must not have
sorry.
smoked very strong
You weren't getting the good
marijuana,
stuff.
but there's
Well,
no
so
question.
there is some grade of marijuana, and
Oh, absolutely. Marijuana is classified as a
As a
hallucinogen and a sedative.
And a schedule.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
absolutely, and marijuana, of course, is addicting physiologically. People who smoke enough marijuana develop addiction. And there's something called anhedonia
Yeah.
that follows heavy use of marijuana, where people lose their interest in a lot of the usual things in life. And there are students at the University of Iowa whose academic performance has really suffered because of marijuana. Again, on a relative basis, marijuana is probably less dangerous than tobacco. Certainly it counts for fewer deaths than tobacco. But
much less
it's
dangerous than alcohol.
That's right, but it's not innocuous.
What exactly, though, do we mean by hallucinations? I mean, are we talking about
Seeing
pink
things.
elephants?
I never saw
Well,
that.
that's during DTs, that's withdrawal from
Seeing things.
Or
alcohol.
you're saying you're seeing something that's not there from smoking marijuana?
What typically happens with marijuana, heavy marijuana intoxication and hallucinations, there's a change in the environment, and things move and change. It's very unnerving. Distances change, sizes of things change, and then people develop paranoia. That's the delusional part, and feel that friends, whatever, are out to do something to them. This is not terribly uncommon consequence of smoking strong marijuana. It doesn't happen most of the time, but it happens enough to be a concern.
I think that's probably laced marijuana.
Yeah.
that's
I think you're-
LSD.
I
or
think,
something,
again, I think
or
you're
something,
kidding yourself.
something like that.
I think the
I
data.
don't smoke
have you
now.
looked-
I haven't smoked for 20 years.
No, but have you looked at the data, the pharmacological data on marijuana use? Things like strong marijuana, kief, or cannabis,
Once again, there are varying
the flowering
variants.
parts of the plant, that's the strong marijuana, and that's really what often induces hallucinations and delusions.
But
So
how many of people that are caught with marijuana or smoke marijuana have that kind? And maybe in today's society, there's a lot more
Well,
of that.
the estimates are maybe of people who
That-
are heavy marijuana users, probably somewhere between 10 and 20% have experienced hallucinations and delusions.
Okay.
And it's scary.
Go
Oh, I
out-
imagine, that's why I would
come-
never
when you
do
go out-
cocaine or anything.
All of the smoking you did at Grinnell, that's fantastic. It just means they were selling you inferior marijuana.
No, that's not true.
If you,
but-
if you go to a bar,
Nothing's
Joe,
inferior at Grinnell.
Oh, okay.
you go to a bar, and a brush against, brush against somebody who's wasted, and they're ready to, punch your face out because you infringed on their, personal bodily boundary. Are they having delusions? And are those the delusions, more or less dangerous? That having, I don't know, paranoid that somebody's going to knock on the door and catch potentially what you're doing. I think violence. There's again DA ad where there's two kids sitting in a room, and they're smoking marijuana, and they're apparently dazed and confused. And one guy opens the desk drawer, and he finds a gun in there, and he starts playing with the gun, and the gun goes off, and something bad I guess happens. Who leaves a gun in their house in an unlocked drawer? I mean, and using that as a and. I mean, if you look at it, how often does it happen that, you have people who are really affected by or under influence of marijuana, let's say, getting violent and hostile, versus in alcohol, that's a much, much more common problem, and one that really, makes it dangerous. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions like that about marijuana, especially, relatively speaking to alcohol. Because I'd be much more afraid to be, with 20 drunks, than 20 people who are high.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the
perspective.
most shocking. I have a real problem with the Office for National Drug Control Policy's ads. The most shocking was they have an ad with a parent. It made its premiere at the Super Bowl. They spent millions and millions of our taxpayer dollars to put out this ad, which I do not agree with at all. A girl's sitting on the toilet in the bathroom. Her parents are in there, and it flashes at the bottom of the screen saying they will be the youngest grandparents or whatever, and they pull out a pregnancy test, and basically the ad says marijuana induces pregnancy. I mean, it almost just says that. Nowhere not one time during the Super Bowl did you see an ad saying alcohol has led to this. Alcohol can lead to this. They don't do that. And this is a bigger problem than marijuana. Why? Why is that? I really
Corporate America.
Exactly.
Yeah,
The next commercial was a Bud Light commercial.
Well, you know why that is.
What?
The economic interests
Exactly.
associated with alcohol. Most people don't make a lot of money from marijuana, but a lot of people make a lot of money.
People make a lot of money from marijuana.
And also,
But maybe
They
they're
can't
not,
advertise.
But they can't advertise, yeah.
and also, the whole reefer madness took its toll. In 1930s, when you have ads where guys playing piano and he's going crazy, his head is
I'm
smoking.
going to kill you.
And those perceptions, and I think anybody who says marijuana is harmless is obviously doesn't know what they're talking about, and it's ridiculous to argue for something like that. But again, having a sensible. The good point is, whoever tries to stop people from using psychoactive substances is doomed to fail. In absolute terms, does that mean now that we don't need to regulate
try, right.
and so forth? Of course we do, and of course there are important issues that need to be addressed, especially in terms of fatalities and drunk driving and things like that. But there's, California saves $100 million a year because they have decriminalized. There's 6 or 7 states in the union that basically decriminalize marijuana, or do you get a ticket? It's something akin to a parking ticket or a step above. And if you look what effect that has for people in those states compared to people in Iowa where you'll go to jail, and of course if you're a minority and this privilege, you're more likely to go to jail than if you're a white rich kid, which is a whole another problem. So by effect, it will targets this privileged population,
Yeah.
but that's I guess the case with any other kind of law trouble in general. And there is, and if you grew up with this sense, this is drugs. Alcohol is one thing. Yes, it's dangerous, but those illegal drugs, and that's what you need to watch for. And it's hard to shake off those, I think, intuitions, and that's why it's, I think, hard. Even when you have policies, initiatives, they're really based on solid data and are sensible and reasonable. It's hard to pass them in a lot of states in the United States because there are these really gut feelings of, illegal, bad,
Well, the legal drugs are responsible for a lot more deaths than the illegal drugs. Tobacco is responsible for close to 500,000 preventable deaths a year, alcohol for about 100,000 a year, and all the other drugs put together are less than 50,000. So it's interesting that it's the legal drugs that cost us a lot of people in this country.
I've read that the University of Iowa has a much higher arrest rate for drug crimes than any other Big Ten school.
Yeah.
You have a
Led the
zero
nation.
tolerance policy in the dorms now, I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah, but actually there's a committee. I met with Judy Palmbaum. They have a committee that's working on the issue of the dorm policies, because I saw it happen, 50 times while I was at Mayflower. Students were kicked out of the dorms for, an RA would walk by, they'd smell marijuana, so they'd knock on the door. They'd see that there's marijuana smoking going on. Immediately, public safety is called. Public safety being just an offshoot of the cops, the police.
University police.
Yeah, they would come and they'd issue a citation, but the buck didn't stop there. Then the citation's forwarded to criminal. It's a criminal offense. So they're not only kicked out of the dorms, but they're facing charges for their use of marijuana in the dorms. I don't think that we should be able to smoke marijuana in the dorms, but I think that they should take a look at what they're doing here. I mean, alcohol. I was caught with alcohol in my dorm. The people that I lived with had it in the fridge, but the fact is, alcohol. You get a second chance. You said you have to go to a meeting. And they set some sort of treatment up. They say, okay, well, you go and learn about alcohol for an hour this night, and you can still live in the dorms. Nothing is done like that with marijuana or other drug use in the dorms. They just kick you out on the streets, basically. And I think that they need to develop a better program of how they deal with people who are caught using marijuana in the dorms, because it's really, once a kid's off living in an apartment or something else, they can smoke marijuana. Their friends can come over. Maybe they get the bright idea, hey, I could deal drugs out of this place. That's where you're going to get problems. If you keep someone in a drug-free zone like the dorms are, it's not going to be such a problem. I mean, you're in a substance-free zone. People can come in and regulate it, but if you're caught right on the spot, boom, you're out of the dorms, no treatment, don't talk about the problem at all, just get out of our hair. That's just not a very sensible way of dealing with drug policy at the university. I think they have problems with that. But I'm hoping that they can develop some sort of treatment where a policy where they don't immediately kick someone out for use of marijuana in the dorms. But who knows? I mean, we can only hope.
I know I was in college here from 72 to 78, and I know a lot of my classmates who smoked marijuana, some a little bit, some a lot, seem to have survived the experience fairly well. Many of them are doctors and lawyers and publishers and stuff. And so what is the effect for students when they leave the university with a degree and an arrest record? Is that...
They might become doctors and lawyers.
Or the president of the United States.
or the president?
OWI convention.
That's a whole nother
Yeah.
story.
I thought it was interesting, going back to the student aid issue, even though 87,000 students nationwide have been barred from federal financial aid because of a drug conviction, last fall there was an article in many papers from the University of Iowa that stated that 10 students who had checked yes, they had been arrested for a drug conviction or left that question blank, were notified by the the financial aid officers that they should change that if they wanted to get financial aid. And there's no mechanism for checking whether they've answered truthfully or not.
Right.
So isn't the whole thing just kind of a joke anyway?
I think it's a self-reported field. Are you gonna tell Are you going to tell on yourself? Are you going to say,
Yeah.
well, yeah, I got busted for
So
school.
all you have to do is lie and-
I don't
and
want
then-
aid for school,
So it's really kind of a...
They actually corrected their form, yeah, so that they were...
Yeah, but it's ridiculous that you would get, if your academic performance suffer, or if there's any indicator that is somehow related to you not living up to your part of the deal on which your aid is based, it makes all sense to pull the aid away.
Right.
But based on something that, for all practical purposes, could be completely irrelevant and unrelated, it's ridiculous.
We're just about to the end of the program, and we're going to go in a minute to Katie Hansen, who's been waiting patiently at the Outrage desk. Before we do that, I just want to thank all of you for being on the show. It's a great discussion, and I think we could probably go on for another hour
yeah.
without too much trouble. Peter Nathan, psychology professor at the University of Iowa. Teresa Seeberger, member of Iowa City Other News and former Radical Grinnell student. Zlatan Krizan, psychology student, graduate student at the university, and Kyle Fitzgerald, freshman at the university. Thanks a lot for coming on. It's been great.
Thank you for having us.
And you're watching Iowa City's Other News. I'm Greg Thompson, and we're going to go now to Katie Hansen, who's the director of the Iowa United Nations Association, with our today's Where's the Outrage segment.
The Iowa United Nations Association is an independent, nonprofit educational organization. And we support the United Nations, and we promote the public discussion of global issues. Before the war with Iraq, the world had months of discussion over the possibility of war. It was the first time in history when whether or not to go to war was discussed worldwide. This in itself is a major success of the peacekeeping processes of the United Nations. The discussion inside the Security Council spread to the peoples who talked, read, and in some cases demonstrated in the streets in cities around the world. Before the war, polls showed that the majority of Americans supported the war, only if it was done with the authority of the United Nations. That authority was never given. And this was probably the right decision, considering now, after the war, the lack of evidence for weapons of mass destruction or any kind of imminent danger from Iraq to the United States. Even if weapons of mass destruction are finally found, they were never used during the war. And it is obvious that their capability to use them was minimal. It looks like the Security Council was right not to vote for war. When the war started, however, the American people threw their support behind the troops. This, of course, was only natural and expected. We have to support our troops. But the majority of Americans also believe, according to the polls, that the United States should be working through the United Nations in a constructive and cooperative manner, whether it be for war or for all the other global issues with which we are confronted. In the case of war with Iraq, this did not happen. And I am outraged that the American people are not demanding that the current administration work through the United Nations, because it is the only way. The new movement by the administration back to the Security Council is a good one. We cannot rebuild Iraq by ourselves. It must be through cooperation with other countries, and that means the United Nations. We cannot fight terrorism by ourselves. It must be through cooperation with other countries, and that means the United Nations. We cannot eliminate smallpox, polio, AIDS, and SARS by ourselves. It must be through cooperation with other countries, and that means the United Nations. There are climate change issues, the problem of refugees, and poverty. Half the world's people live on less than $2 a day. We cannot solve these issues by ourselves. If we ever expect other nations not to build nuclear weapons, we must not be a threat to them ourselves. This can only be accomplished through cooperation with other countries. The only way to have universal law and order is by working with others and cooperating to create the necessary systems. And we must be willing to adhere to these laws ourselves if we expect other countries to follow suit. In the end, the United Nations can only do what the nations of the world can agree on together. The United Nations is a place to come together and talk out our differences. And we, the people, must demand that the United States create a foreign policy open to cooperation and constructive participation in solving global problems. If we insist on going alone, we only create more problems, as we now have in Iraq. We are now responsible for reconstruction, education, and nation building in a country we know little about. The United States must pay its dues to the United Nations. We must talk and listen. We must not walk out of meetings or on our treaty obligations. We must join with other nations. We will not always get our way, but we will move forward rather than backward in the process of solving problems. We must go through the United Nations. We cannot do otherwise but go through the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for patiently waiting. That was great. Well, that brings us just about to the end of today's show. This is Iowa City's Other News. I'm your host, Greg Thompson, and we're going to go out and inform you about some upcoming events here on the television. So stay tuned. Our next show will be May 24th, and we're going to be talking about the budget cuts that the Iowa City Council is working on. Thanks for watching.
Here comes a rap song, country song, heavy metal folk song, coming from the well that's fed the prophets writing all along. It's on to the highest goal that humankind could want to reach. I come to talk to you, I didn't write this song to preach. So listen close, I ain't verbose like rappers talking hype. My time is far too precious, plus I just plain ain't the type. This song it goes and flows out to all my Americans, North, South, and Central, and my family in Afghanistan. Israelis, Arabs, Europeans, yeah, and Africans. You get the picture, can the strictest keeping peace from being friends? I come to break down borders, redefine the new world order. Bleed truth in this recorder, be a global building motor. I have one aim that's plain and straight ahead of me, to be a new world order, setting myself free. Yippee-yi-yi, fire raining down from the sky today. But hey, what's that sound? Babylon is falling down. Babylon is falling down. I'm a new world order, talking about the world to be. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, getting people all around to stand up for equality. We're free, we be lots of people just like me. That's why we're really freaking out Tom Warner and the FCC. This ain't no kitty cuss words, but real controversy. Makes the fake cowboys in Congress shake inside their boots. The new world order rips the weeds of lies up by the roots. I guess it's great that their time's late and it's become my fate to write with so much love these words impossible to hate. I scan Will Rogers, Walt Whitman, and Hank Williams too. Two Bobs, Marley, Dylan, Nas, and Ani.